Towards Understanding with Clayton Bjelan values being a positive radio program for everyone. As we present today's episode, please accept this little ears warning. Some of the themes discussed may not be suitable for children.
Welcome to Towards Understanding, and as the name does suggest, we talk about this idea that we want to head towards a better understanding of some part of our world. We want to understand some part of who God is, our place in the world. And one man who has been doing that for many decades, helping people, is Professor John Lennox. He's written countless books. He is a mathematician extraordinaire, and he joins us right now as well. John, thank you so much for your time.
It's my pleasure to be with you in Australia and New Zealand, two of my favorite countries.
Oh, we love that. I did have to look up, I know your specialty in maths is around group theory. Is that correct? I had to look that up, and I still am not that much sure I'm that wiser from it. How do you describe that quickly? Are you able to do that?
Well, you can't describe it quickly, but one part of it is the study of symmetry, the mathematics of symmetry, but that's only one aspect of it. It's a branch of algebra.
Yeah, I shouldn't have asked for simply, but yes, I certainly started reading it. I think I'm going to have to ask him what it is. We're here to have a chat as well about a new book that you've put out, Science and God. You've done this also with Katie Morgan, and this idea that says, do you have to choose? And this has actually been something that you've had many debates about with people, that there has seemed to be, especially over the past few decades, this sort of idea that says you can either have faith in God or believe in science. And that's something that I know on multiple levels you have conversations about. Was there a time that you have put down that this sort of started becoming more and more obvious?
Well, over life, it was pretty early on when I could see very clearly from my own studies that this was a nonsense, the idea that you had to choose between science and God. But when you get it from very high-powered figures like the late Stephen Hawking, you begin to wonder why it is they come to that conclusion. And I ended up realizing, much to my surprise in a way, that in Hawking's case and in many other cases, they were confused about the nature of science and they were confused about the nature of God. And to cut a long story short, their concept of God was the so-called God of the gaps. That is, I don't understand this, so I postulate God to explain it. Now, that kind of God will disappear gradually as science fills in those gaps. And I realized then that if you define God to be placeholder for what you don't yet understand, of course you have to choose between science and God. But the God of the Bible is not the God of the gaps. He's the God of the whole show. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, not simply the bits that we don't understand. And I think the easiest way to explain it is when Sir Isaac Newton found his law of gravitation, he didn't say, now I understand gravity, I don't need God. It was the opposite. He wrote the most famous book in the history of science, the Principia Mathematica, with the hope that it would persuade a thinking person to believe in the deity. In other words, it was the bits of the universe he did understand that pointed him towards God. And of course, that's true in ordinary life. The more you understand about engineering, the more you can admire the genius of the turbofan jet and so on. So there's a lot of confusion here, and we can go into it if you like, but I've done so in my book that you refer to. And I should mention, Clayton, that my co-author, Katie Morgan, is a very distinguished children's author, and she's got a real genius at reaching young people. And I'm very honored to have been able to co-author a book with her.
Let's just talk briefly around that, because as I was reading it, I'm like, it does feel like it has this beautiful quality of a children's book. But at the same time, as an adult, I could very much read it and be like, well, actually, I like things explained the way sometimes it is to a kid or to a teen, because that helps me understand it. It felt very accessible in that sense.
Yes, well, I've heard this before. Someone said to me, that I've read it and it's entirely suitable for adults. And that's fine. Really, there are two books here. The first book, which is already out, which in a way is slightly more advanced, is called Can Science Explain Everything? And it was reckoned that it wasn't quite suitable for a younger age. Katie, particularly, and I set out to transform it. So people that start off with the book you have in your hand can then progress onto Can Science Explain Everything, where they learn a little bit more. And also, I deal with a much broader set of subjects, the rationality of Christianity, in other words, why I believe it.
Let's start by talking about some of these. One of the things that you are incredibly passionate about is that even as we use the word faith, we've got to be really clear about that word, that it's not just someone who has a faith who is somebody who has a faith in God, but actually someone who believes nothing in terms of an atheistic view has a faith in that too. Could you just talk about why you are so passionate about the fact that we all have faith in something?
I'm passionate about it because there's so much confusion. Unfortunately, the stampede of the new atheists, which has died down a lot, but Richard Dawkins and his cohort have managed to convince many people that faith is a religious word and it means believing where there's no evidence. And they're wrong on both counts. Believing where there's no evidence is not faith in the normal sense, it's blind faith. And faith is not a religious term, except in the sense, and here's where the problem comes from. The word faith in English is used for two very separate things. The first is religion, like the Jewish faith, the Muslim faith, the Christian faith, things to be believed. But then it's used personally for my subjective faith, the things I believe. And of course, that applies to all of life. I believe at the moment that I'm talking to someone in Australia. I believe that Australia exists, and so on. And what we need to realize is that every one of us, whether we're religious or not, have a worldview that we believe. And atheism is such a worldview. And failure to recognize that leads to hilarious results, like Christopher Hitchens writing in one of his books, Our Faith is Not a Faith, Our Beliefs Are Not a Belief, which is sheer nonsense. And Dawkins claiming that he had no faith, and yet he writes long books on what he believes. So to sum all that up, it's very important that each of us really realizes, whether we're Christians or not, that we have a worldview that we believe. And the big question to ask is it true or not? And in my particular case, the questions I get asked all the time is, does science help us here? Where does science point? Does it point towards God or not? So let's get out of this idea of having faith on one side and science on the other, which is a total tragedy, a double tragedy, because faith is essential to science, which we can discuss as we go on.
One of the other things that you're keen to distinguish is around the idea of what science is for as a very specific area, because it has been stretched by many, and many you mentioned too, to sort of explain a whole lot of things that it's actually not designed for. Could you give us the sort of summary of what you're saying science is for?
Yes, well, natural sciences, which we're talking about here, are powerful, and they're powerful to a certain extent because they only offer a certain kind of explanation. And it's failure to see that has led to what we call scientism. That is the idea that science can explain everything, which is nonsense, of course, because if that were the case, all your universities in Australia and elsewhere would have to close half their faculties. Because if we think of a university, it's got the natural sciences, but it's history, languages, music, culture, all those kind of things, which are not science in the strict sense, but they are rational disciplines. And one of the huge mistakes that has come out of this science can explain everything idea is that science is coextensive with rationality, which it is not. And it's very important to see. For example, I am very interested in philosophy and theology. They're not natural science, but they certainly are rational disciplines. So to sum up to bring it down to earth as we do in the book, when you're thinking of science, you're generally speaking thinking of explaining the how and the what, and possibly the why of function. Why is this bit here, not there? But you're not dealing with the why of purpose. And a very simple illustration of that, which we give in the book, is why is the water boiling? Well, because the heat energy from gas flame is agitating the molecules of water, and that's why it's boiling. But I could equally well say it's boiling because I want a cup of coffee. Now, those two explanations are very different. One is in terms of science, physics, heat. The other is in terms of agency, my desire for a cup of coffee. But a moment's thought, and I find children can see this very clearly, those two explanations do not conflict. They don't compete, they complement each other. And one way of putting it is to say the God explanation of the universe no more conflicts with a genuine scientific explanation than the Henry Ford explanation competes with automobile engineering and physics as an explanation of the motor car. They complement each other. And if we could only realize that there are different kinds of explanation, a lot of hate would be taken out of this.
Those arguments make perfect sense, right? And I think it's also been the arguments that have been made for many, many centuries before the last few centuries as well, that people were very fine to coexist between what we might call very more traditionally science, faith in God, these sorts of things. Why has it become something that you think that people have now tried to say, actually, this is not the way we should be putting these together. We should try and separate it. Your argument is, no, they should be the same. Why are people trying to separate it, do you think?
Well, there is a separation, but what is it between? It's not between science and God, and that's the key thing. If you take the Nobel Prize for Physics, atheists have won it, Christians have won it. So if you take those examples, they're not separated by their science, but what they're separated by is their worldview, atheism and theism. Those are distinct. The key question is, therefore, which one of them, if any, does science support? And that's the important thing, that we realize that this isn't a battle between science and religion. It is a battle between theism and atheism, and there are scientists on both sides. And once you realize that, you can think straight about it and ask, where does the evidence point? That's the key question.
From somebody, say, who is listening at the moment and saying, well, I don't have a belief that there even is a God. I want to go about trying to find proof that there is God, and then therefore I can believe. Is that a helpful way to start a journey around understanding that? Is there perhaps a better way you'd encourage them?
Well, it's a helpful way to start if you know what you mean by the word proof. I'm a mathematician, and proof in the strict, rigorous mathematical sense only occurs in mathematics. It doesn't occur in physics, engineering, chemistry, or any other field. In other fields, we use the legal definition of proof, and that is proof beyond reasonable doubt, evidence, indicators. And when people say to me, can you prove that God exists? Well, I say, not in the mathematical sense, because you can't prove that you exist in the mathematical sense. But what we can do is give evidence on which you can base trust in God. If faith is proportioned to evidence, then you can build up a conviction, not only that God exists, but that you can be related to him through Christ. So it is a useful way, provided you know what you're asking for. But if you're asking for mathematical proof, you'll never get it, because you only get that in mathematics. That's no disadvantage. It's just that we need to be clear what we're talking about.
Let's take that example. Someone's wanting to start and say, okay, I understand that. I want to find evidence that leads me towards that conclusion. Where would be some of the places that you would encourage people to start? I know you referenced a few in the book, but where might that be?
Well, it depends. Generic questions are very difficult, Clayton, but it depends on the person. Some people are interested in the logical, philosophical, scientific side. And I would start there with the very fact that we can do mathematics. In other words, that the universe is to a certain extent mathematically intelligible. That, to me, points towards a vast intelligence behind it. And indeed, the interesting thing about that is it's what Einstein called the fundamental faith of all scientists. Scientists are people of faith because in order to do any science, you must start by believing that the universe is rationally intelligible. And the next question is, why would you believe that if there's no God or no mind behind it? And it's there that atheism, I think, runs into the dust, because it has no ultimate explanation other than chance and natural processes, wherever they came from, to explain the fact that we can do science with our own rational intelligence. So that's where I would start. And keeping within science, I would then go next to some of the results of science. I did a session for some philosophy students in Oxford some time ago at the request of their professor, who's a famous atheist. And he said, I want you to talk to my students on why you believe there's a God. And by the way, he said, I hope that you will use the very best argument against atheism. And I said, I will if you tell me what it is. So he said, yes. Now, this is an atheist speaking. He said, if ever I was to become a Christian, he said, one of the big things that would weigh with me was the fine-tuning of the universe. And there's an Australian, Dr. Barnes, Professor Barnes, who's written one of the best books on this in existence, by the way. The fact that the universe is extremely special to fine-tuning points to a tuner. If you go to a concert in the Sydney Opera House and the piano is perfectly in tune, you know there's a tuner. And it's that kind of idea that we could expand on. But you see, for other people, I was talking to a brilliant cognitive scientist, well known, in fact, world famous, not long ago. And the last time I encountered her at Oxford she was a very, very acerbic atheist. And this time, to my amazement, I discovered that she'd become a Christian believer. And I said, what happened to you? And she said, you know, the odd thing is, it has nothing to do with my science whatsoever. I said, what happened? Well, she said, I moved home and my next door neighbors showed me friendship and they took me to their church and so on. And I began to experience the love of Christians, and one thing led to another. And in the end, I could see that Christianity was true. So here's another kind of evidence. And of course, many people have become Christians because of the friendship shown to them by other Christians that's rescued them from loneliness and meaninglessness. And indeed, I would say these days, folks are more likely to respond to that than they are to the abstractions of science and philosophy. So it depends entirely on who you are. The marvelous thing is that this kind of cumulative evidence coming from many sources, of course, increases the likelihood of Christianity being true. It actually works in practice.
My guest is Professor John Lennox. He has written this book, Science and God, with Katie Morgan. And we're going to be back talking to him a bit more about his conversations, his debates that he's had around the world. And I'm also led to believe very soon his autobiography is coming out as well. So we're going to have a chat to him about that on the way next here on Towards Understanding.
Share your brand, your event, your message across 90 Christian radio stations and major cities in Australia and New Zealand by sponsoring Towards Understanding, hosted by Clayton Bjelan. More than 210,000 people tune into Towards Understanding each week, and with just one sponsorship, you'll reach this immense engaged audience. Find out more about this exciting and unique opportunity now on the sponsorship page at positivemedia.com.au.
This is Towards Understanding. My name is Clayton Bjelan. I am joined by Professor John Lennox. He is author of many books, including this one, Science and God, that we're talking about at the moment. It is really sort of targeted towards children and teens, I suppose, who are asking the question, do you have to choose? And John has certainly been able to express, as we've already been talking about a bit earlier on, about many reasons why there is evidence for God. Ultimately, you do land in the book, John, and indeed, I think, any argument for Christianity must always come down to a conversation around Jesus' death and his resurrection. And certainly even with the resurrection, which is the hardest of what people maybe might find to get their heads and hearts around, there is also lots of evidence that points to that as well.
Yes, there is, and it's important. And by the way, I might mention some of your listeners and watchers may be interested in the fact that I have made a full-length documentary film that discusses these two sides. The first half of it is filmed in Oxford and has to do with the evidence for God, theism. But the second half is filmed in Israel and has to do with the specific evidences surrounding Jesus Christ. And you're absolutely right. The heart of Christianity, in the sense that the early apostles, right down to the present, they preached that Jesus rose from the dead. He was raised from the dead, to be more accurate, by the power of God. And that is a demonstration that he was precisely who he claimed to be, the Jewish Messiah, the Son of God, God incarnate. And of course, that's a big mouthful for people to take on board. And often they balk at that. As happened to me some time ago, I was talking to 700 or 800 physicists, and one of them, who's a professor at Oxford, came to me afterwards and said, I found that talk about God and science interesting, but he said, I think you're a Christian. He was pretty sharp. And he said, there's a problem with that, isn't there? And I said, what's the problem? And he said, well, you're obliged to believe that Jesus is both God and human. Isn't that so? I said, that is exactly so. Well, he said, how is that possible? Can you explain it to me? Well, I said, since we're in a question-asking mode, let me ask you something easier. He said, okay, fire away. So I said, what is consciousness? He got stuck immediately. And he said, we don't know. I said, that's fine. I don't know either. So let's try something easier. What is energy? Well, he said, we can measure it. We can use it. I said, that wasn't my question. What is it? And I said, be careful with your answer, because I've read Richard Feynman, who won the Nobel Prize for Physics. So in the end, he said, I don't know. I said, that's very interesting. Tell me, do you believe in consciousness and energy? Yes, he said, I do. Well, I said, that's very interesting. You don't know what they are and you believe in them. I said, you were about to write me off because I couldn't explain to you how God could become human. Should I now write you off as a physicist because you believe in these much simpler things and you don't know what they are? He said, please don't, please don't. But I said, I want to push this a bit. I said, why do you believe in them if you don't know? Well, that stuck him completely. So being a kind man, I helped him out. I said, I think you believe in them because although you don't know exactly what they are, they're useful concepts. They do work for you. They have some sort of explanatory power and they help you to discuss deep things. He said, that's right. Well, I said, it's exactly the same. I believe that Jesus was both God and human. Not because I can explain it. Nobody could. This is the depths of the nature of God. But because it's the only explanation that makes sense. Oh, he said, that's fine. Let's talk further. And we did. And that's very important, actually, Clayton, because many people stop and they say, well, you couldn't possibly understand that, so I couldn't believe it. We believe in many things that we do not understand. Consciousness and energy are two of them. So I learned from that something very important. You don't need to be able to explain everything in order to get some handle on it. But now to the specifics. The big area of contention when it comes to resurrection is that it's supernatural, it's a miracle, and science has shown that miracles are impossible. So we couldn't possibly believe in it because we now understand the laws of nature. Now that sounds very plausible. It's an argument that comes from David Hume centuries ago, the Scottish Enlightenment philosopher. But it's a wrong-headed argument. As C.S. Lewis beautifully pointed out, if I go and stay in London in a hotel overnight, the first night I put £100 in the drawer beside my bed, and the second night I put another 100, and the third night I do another 100. Mathematics tells me, arithmetic tells me I've got £300 in the drawer. If I wake up on the fourth morning when I'm about to leave the hotel and I find £50 in the drawer, what do I conclude? Do I say the laws of mathematics have been broken or the laws of England have been broken? Well, now it's obvious the laws of England have been broken. How do I know that? Because the laws of mathematics have not been broken. You see, I thought that my drawer and the room were a closed system of cause and effect. They turned out not to be. They were open to a thief sticking his or her hand in and removing 350 quid. It's because we know the laws of nature. And what are they? They are how nature normally behaves unless there's intervention. Now, observation will tell us that dead people don't normally rise. But you see, there's nothing in science or anything else that stops God, who created the whole system, injecting his power and raising a dead body. Jesus didn't rise because of natural processes going on in the grave 5 minutes before it happened. No, he was raised from the dead. And it's because we know that that doesn't normally happen that we know that there's been intervention. I mentioned the law of gravity earlier. It tells me that if I drop an apple, it'll fall towards the center of the earth, but that doesn't stop you catching it. The point is that God has set norms, regularities, we call them the laws of nature, and it is they that help us to recognize when he does something special. So Christians aren't people that ignore the laws of nature. They use them, they believe in them, because they help us to see that God has intervened on this special occasion. And nothing science can tell us can forbid God doing that. And that's important because that then opens the way for the possibility that Jesus rose. Now, you need to get at that event by studying history, psychology, the textual evidence of the New Testament, all the rest of it. It's a unique event, and that's the way we get it, unique events. And the testimony of those many people who have started off trying to disprove the resurrection and coming to believe it is worth citing, and it's all out there. There's plenty of evidence to convince us that Jesus rose from the dead is a matter of history. And I would stake my life on it, and I have done for the last ever so many years.
We've also interviewed many people in this show who've spent their life exploring that question and have indeed come to that conclusion as well. John, you are one of the greatest debaters that I've ever seen in terms of how you argue the case, and yet you also do it in such a kind way and in a pointed way, but kind, whereas I've seen other people who certainly can't seem to get that balance together. Is debating and those sorts of things a very natural thing for you, or is it something you've worked on very hard?
Well, it's not. My first debate with Richard Dawkins was the first time I'd ever done a debate like that.
Wow.
I have no experience of debating at school, but I have masses of experience of discussing with individuals. And that's how I regard a debate. I try to ignore the crowds, the TV cameras and everything else and talk to people as individuals. And I've learned by seeing what happens when people lose their cool. They lose it completely, and it's no way to conduct a civilized conversation. As we were going on stage for the first Dawkins debate many years ago now, he said to me, "You know, I don't debate." I wasn't quite sure what that meant because he'd done several debates. Maybe it was that he didn't debate people like me. And I said, "If it's any comfort to you, Richard, I don't either. All I'm going to try to do now is to put to the audience a rational alternative to your atheism and allow them to choose." And he said, "I'll buy that." And we went out. I think the crucial thing is to avoid ad hominem arguments, getting cross with people, pushing them down. No, we're there to discuss ideas, and I want to allow people to decide. And that's hugely important. God doesn't force himself on us by any kind of violence, intellectual or otherwise. Christ came into our world. He showed kindness and love to people. He dealt quite roughly with bigots, but that's another matter. But he showed the love of God and invited a response. And I want to do the same, because the biggest thing in all of this is not winning an argument, but it is showing people that they can have a relationship with God that is entirely fulfilling, because it's ultimately what we as human beings were created in his image for. And you don't do that by getting cross or angry or anything else.
I want to talk about two of your books as well. There's countless books to talk about. But firstly, last year you put out a book around God and AI and sort of it's just the end of history, looking at the book of Revelation. Obviously a topic that everyone is so keen on at the moment. As people talk about it, I think one of the key things is that everyone is asking themselves, how should I be thinking about AI? Even more than the using, that's sort of a whole other aspect of it. As you think through this from your perspectives of both science and in terms of God. How do you think about AI yourself?
Well, that's a big question to raise near the end of an interview.
I
But
know.
let me make very clear that the book God, AI, at the End of History is understanding the book of Revelation in an age of intelligent machines. That title has misled people into thinking that's my latest book on AI. It is not. My latest book on AI is the second edition of 2084, which is now subtitled 2084 and the AI Revolution. That is my main work to date on AI. And very briefly, artificial intelligence is here. It raises a massive number of questions. Narrow AI, which is the main sort of AI that's working at the moment, does one thing that normally requires human intelligence, is making great strides in medicine, but creating alarming problems in surveillance technology and the danger of turning countries into totalitarian states. So even the AI that's working raises huge ethical problems. And I think the way of looking at it is like a sharp knife. It can be used for surgery or it can be used for murder. And what I've tried to do in the book is to deal with that sort of AI, our response to it, and then the much more speculative AI that is accelerating, and that is the move towards AI not merely being a tool, but being an agent. And the problem created by the fact that even the leaders in the industry don't entirely understand what they've created and are raising big questions about it going rogue and increasing the dark areas of life. And I'm particularly concerned about its effect on young people, which is utterly devastating, feeding poison into young people's minds. But I've dealt with that thoroughly, I hope, for the moment anyway, in my book 2084. Your listeners want to see what I think, then that's the book to go for. However, AI raises big questions about the future of humanity. And in biblical terms, the book of Revelation is important, and Christians have shied away from it because of its symbolism, its strangeness. And I've tried to demystify it and show that it's entirely relevant and very important for our current age.
The final book we do want to have a chat about is the one that's about to come out. It's your autobiography. My Story, I believe, is what the title of it is. How did you come about to say, okay, I'm going to try and summarize this? Is it a book that was always there that you're thinking, oh, I'm always going to get to writing this? Or did someone give you a bit of a prompt? How about you write this, John?
Oh, no, I wasn't always thinking about it. I don't like the auto in autobiography. It's about yourself. And what two things actually changed my mind. First of all, reading Acts, Paul, the Christian apostle, came back to a church, and it carefully says, Luke says, how he told the church what God had done with them. And I thought, well, if the apostle can talk about what he believes God did with him, then I can possibly do the same and hope that it will provide evidence for God, for readers of all kinds, all faiths and none. The second thing is, there's a considerable part of my story that has never been told before by anybody because it involves traveling behind the Iron Curtain during the Cold War and to Russia and Ukraine, which are very much in the news today, sadly, after the Cold War. And that represents a huge period of my life, which I rarely ever discuss. And now, for the first time in print, I have described what I believe God led me to do during those years when I was doing a lot of traveling that nobody knew anything about. So there's the motivation. The prompting came from many friends who kept telling me that I ought to do it. And in one sense, I should have been a better diarist. I didn't keep a proper diary, particularly of the times when I was abroad, which is a pity. But we reconstructed it. It's a fairly big book anyway. And if you look at Amazon, you'll see a very full description of it.
Final one around that. Was it a different style of writing you had to take up? with it? Or, you've written so many books. Did you sort of approach it in the same way, or did you sort of have to throw all of that out and start it again because, there is only one autobiography that you write? So it's sort of very unique in that.
Not consciously. I regard myself as an author these days. I enjoy writing whatever it's about. And you're right. I mean, style is different. A mathematical paper that I write is very different from a letter to my wife. But I've done a lot of reading and writing in my life, and I'm now 82. So in one sense, it wasn't difficult to tell a story. In fact, dealing with complex philosophical, theological issues, in one sense, much harder. But I've tried to tell a story with a purpose. In other words, tried to use my story as part of the evidence that we've been talking about, but at the level of actual experience of life. And I hope people will get to enjoy that.
We wish you all the best with that book, the autobiography, My Story, the book, Science and God. Do you have to choose, especially targeted towards younger readers? Professor John Lennox, it is an absolute privilege to have a conversation with you. Thank you for your time, and thanks for chatting to us on Towards Understanding.
My pleasure. And let me say good night, Australia. Good night, New Zealand. Bye-bye.